Good morning. So I'm here to bring you some important words of testimony from a dark time in our nation's history, another dark time. So as Rachel mentioned, it was 75 years ago to this day that Executive Order 9066 was issued by the President of the United States ordering the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens of the United States, born here in this country. Men, women, and children. So, at that time, there was no public outcry. There was hardly a voice of opposition. The biggest outcry was from the states, the governors of Idaho, Arkansas, Nevada, who were outraged that the Japanese would be sent there. They didn't want the prison camps built in their states. But there were exceptions in this community. When the Japanese Americans here were ordered to report to custody, First Congregational Church of Berkeley and other congregations wanted some measure of dignity to be provided to those incarcerated. So when the Army declared that the Japanese should report to a vacant lot on Shattuck, and the church offered Pilgrim Hall as an alternative, and the people of those churches came to the church to provide some hospitality, comfort, and dignity to the Japanese Americans reporting there in April of that year. So there were records kept, some journals, letters that were compiled by our dear Cheryl Henderson, who in 1942 was a 19-year-old student at Cal, deeply moved by what she saw happening at our church. So I'll read to you from some of those archives. Here are the words of Vera Loper, who was senior minister at that time, recorded in his journal. April 28th, 1942. The evacuation of the Japanese is taking place through our church. A boy brings me the ashes of his father to keep in the church. A Buddhist wants to make a contribution to the church in appreciation of what we are doing. Mr. Takahashi and his wife are getting on the bus. He planned the gardens at Treasure Island. She has tears in her eyes. He is silent. A few months later, the church secretary wrote to some of the internees asking them to write about their experiences and what was happening to them at the detention centers. For the most part, the letters in response are polite, gracious, uncomplaining, in keeping with cultural norms. But a few passages reveal what we now know to be the traumatic, soul-damaging effects of Executive Order 9066. So I'll read a few of those passages to you. From a letter written by Ikuko, July 26, 1942. We in the Santa Anita Assembly Center are surrounded by great natural beauties on the outside, for there are beautiful mountains to the northeast and lovely residential sections to the south. But we are fenced in 100 acres of sand and gravel with monotonous rows upon rows of black barracks and green stables. There is little individuality either in our living quarters, our manner of living, or in the people themselves. We are on the whole being treated pretty well, especially when one thinks about those in the concentration camps of Europe. I feel, though, that the comparison should not be made, because this is America, and we should set the example, not imitate the actions of the fascists. Mari writes on August 7, 1942, from Tanforan, one gets such a feeling of insidiousness as compared to the life outside these barbed-wired fences. One's perspective becomes as so one-dimensional that there seems to be a timelessness about the time we have been in camp. There seems to have been no life previous to the one which we are living now. There seems to be no future. And a letter from Hayao, August 5, 1942, from Santa Anita. People expect us to be grateful that we are being treated as well in camp, and they say, well, aren't you getting food, clothing, and shelter? No, we are not satisfied, because that isn't half the story. the real truth isn't getting out to the outside world. It is being suppressed to satisfy the conscience of our politicians, race baiters, and economic interests. It's a shock. It's eating mud. It rubs one the wrong way. Your faith in the American way of life wavers. You begin to wonder about your Caucasian friends. You get mad. You start to hate the wrong people. You make generalities, and you don't sleep well.
Just hearing those words, let's just take a deep breath. Welcome the stranger, because you may not know you may be entertaining an angel. This passage, and actually several stories in our scripture, point to the Middle Eastern practice of hospitality. That when a stranger came to your place, wherever it was, wherever you were, the first thing you did was you welcomed them in. You probably called for food to be made and for something to drink to be brought. That was the default, that the stranger would be welcomed. Stranger is a relational word. It describes a relationship between two people. It doesn't describe a particular person. It describes a relationship between two people. If I don't know you, we're strangers. Actually, we're both strangers. As soon as we meet each other, we're no longer strangers. If we don't meet each other, we remain strangers. Both of us. We are wired for fear. As a matter of fact, we are overwired for fear. The brain people know this to be more and more true, that there are these two kind of dueling parts of ourselves. The part that responds to immediate stimuli in the environment, the things that are wired to help keep us safe, and then an ability actually to understand a greater reality than terror. And these two parts of ourselves are sometimes in conflict with each other. All of our spiritual disciplines are actually practices of moving from that lower self to the higher self. To recognize that those things are part of ourselves, that ability to respond quickly to something that is scary or maybe threatening. But we also know that we can think through things and make other choices that may actually make more sense in any particular situation. But the thing I want us to notice is that response, that fear response, is a powerful one, and we should never underestimate it. To welcome the stranger, considering that we might be entertaining an angel, is a message to that center of fear that says, oh, perhaps I don't need to react in that way. Perhaps there is another way, because look what might happen if I step over that. We are wired for fear. But we're also wired for curiosity and compassion and connection and community and cooperation. And in some ways, those patterns may be as strong and as powerful if we pay attention to them. So, our spiritual traditions tell us that as we come up against something we don't know, our default position is going to be to step over our fear and to enter into the possibility of relationship. You may be entertaining an angel. And you know those angels kept appearing, didn't they? They kept appearing. And what was the first thing they always said? Don't be afraid. Because if an angel shows up, of course you're going to be afraid. But thank God, you know, the shepherds, they're out on the fields. The angels show up, and the shepherds all run. And that's the end of the story. Now, what would have happened if those shepherds had listened to the first thing that their brains were telling them? To run in fear. But no, they stopped to listen and to learn, to make friends with the angels. Fear is what can create something like that executive order. And I'm not saying that there wasn't justifiable fear. I think if we were to take that point of view, it would be hard for many people to understand why that wasn't acknowledged, that it might have been a scary time. It's important to acknowledge that. And it's also important to acknowledge other realities. But fear is the sort of thing that can lead to an executive order where 110 to 120,000 people living in the United States can be sent essentially to camps, concentration camps, essentially. This is what can happen when fear is used as a broad brush. It's both the blessing and the curse of the federal government that things they do have a huge effect. That can be used for good and it can be used for ill. And in this case, a broad approach based in fear led to a lot of wrong. A lot of wrong. Because people chose to be afraid. And today, we watch as fear is being stoked across the political conversation. And fear is a powerful thing. It's the first thing that grabs you. You say, these people are dangerous. The first response is, yes, that must be true. I have to acknowledge that that's the first. Someone says, be afraid. And I think, okay. But I am capable of thinking better, to recognize that fear is going to lead us into trouble. If we make decisions based in fear, especially if we make big, large, national, governmental decisions based in fear, then much wrong will happen. The reverberations of the executive order continue to play out in our culture. Continue to play out. Both our chagrin, our shame that this thing happened, as well as the way it still affects the lives of people around us today. Something like that just doesn't happen and end. It has a long-term effect on family, on friends, on communities, and that is why it is so dangerous to take that kind of approach when we're afraid. The root of terrorism is quite simply to make people more afraid than they should be. That's the definition of terrorism. I'm going to do something that's not only going to affect a certain number of people, but it's going to make a whole lot of people afraid. And we know that, don't we? I mean, in the culture at the moment, many of us are afraid of terrorism. Even though the chance that something will happen to us personally is infinitesimal. But unfortunately, math doesn't speak to fear very well. I pray for the day when it will, that probability will trump fear. But unfortunately, it usually doesn't work that way. There are so many threads that are woven in to that decision for the executive order that we think it could be as cut and dried as a response to Pearl Harbor, as a response to the concerns about the imperialism of the Japanese government, their war-making. But if you look in the record, there are all these threads of racism, of concern about the people of Japanese ancestry taking over farmland in California and other places. All sorts of elements of this that are rooted in racism and not even in any sort of reality around the fear that was happening during the war. Part of this order, and one of the interesting things about this is that the executive order was relatively vague about what it did. And then if you look at the timeline, there are like 4 or 5 other steps that get taken until people are called. You must report. You must turn yourselves in. You must pack your 2 bags. You must get on these buses. You must go to these camps. But that wasn't the first thing that happened. It was like, this happens, and then the slippery slope of 3 or 4 or 5 other decisions made both by the national government and by the military. So it isn't always completely clear when the first thing happens what might happen after that. And we're watching this play out today, this week, next week, today. This is happening again. We're trying to solve a problem which is worth trying to solve, but we're trying to solve it with tools that are going to create a whole lot of wrong. What if we were to take that attitude, which is a hard thing to do, that the choice I'm going to make is to welcome, understanding that we are both strangers and that we can step over that relational divide, either directly or indirectly. We know from our history about the role that immigrants have played in this country and about the phases of immigrant experience in our country, where so many groups have come and have been the stranger and then have been made part of this whole. We should be able to learn from that history, and that is one of our other abilities, is to learn from our history. But it feels like some of the very same mistakes we've made in the past, we are on the route to making them again. So I'm calling you, I'm calling all of us, I'm calling myself to recognize when that relational thing happens where I feel like I'm confronted with the stranger, either directly or indirectly. And our practice of being open to that, even taking the risk of vulnerability, because that is the path toward peace. That is the path toward peace. If I put up my defenses and that's the only way I have to react, nothing can happen out of that. And chances are I am no safer than I was the moment before. This is a hard thing to do, which is why we have to be reminded to do it by the scriptures. We have to remember that this is not just an individual thing, it's a community thing, it's a God thing. That we have to draw on the power, on a greater power than what we can handle ourselves when we're trying to deal with situations like this. That we need to be able to draw on the power of the community, of the faith community, of the power of God's presence with us, our safety and our security. And we have to be willing to take that risk, each one of us, in our own lives, if we expect our government to do that, if we expect to understand the wrongs that have happened out of the attitude of creating that stranger relationship and being unwilling to budge from that. If we carry on in the direction that we are, in 40 years, in 70 years, we'll be going through the same process that we're going through now, of regretting, of repenting, of our shame, of our sense of injustice. And we have a chance to make something different happen. So I want to lift up, I want to honor the lives of those people who were affected. I want to lift up the courage of some of the people who started our community, who have been in our community, who had a different vision of what might happen. Mostly people were taken off to racetracks and to fairgrounds, any kind of open place where people of Japanese ancestry could be gathered. And people in our community said, there's not much we can do, but we can do this. Let us have that same courage to push back against injustice, to understand that the people of the world, whether we know them or not, are angels. Perhaps if just we thought every time we saw the word immigrant, we just lifted that up and we put in angel. There are thousands of angels trying to escape from Syria, from a war. And they're knocking at the door. That might change our attitude a little bit. As soon as we know each other, we're no longer strangers. It can happen that quickly that we move from one to the other. In our tradition, the way we do church, unfortunately, we don't have too many ways to lament, to be able to say, this is a wrong that happened. And we acknowledge that. And even though we can't change the wrong, we can speak to it. We can say, this was wrong. We can stand with the people who suffered, whether they're still living or not. This afternoon, a group of people are going to create a ritual at our church in honor of what people at our church did. And I'm really glad that Angela Urata is here today visiting with us. She's been instrumental in helping us organize this event this afternoon. Cynthia Winton-Henry will be providing leadership for that. That's at 2:30. And it'll be outside if it doesn't rain. It'll be in Loper Chapel if it does. As an art response, as a way of shifting of the energy of lament, essentially. But I'd like to invite you into a moment of lament if you're willing and able. If you would like to just make a sign of your own sense of whatever words you want to use to describe your reaction to what our country has done and is doing, I'll just invite you to stand, to open up your hands, stand if you're willing. And Amar and I are just going to create a little bit of a lament as a way of saying the things that words can't say. Hallelujah.